They planted trees on her land without asking and billed her $2,000. When Claire confronted the smug HOA president, he dismissed her protests, confident she wouldn't fight back. But he didn't know she'd uncover a secret that would bring his entire scheme crashing down. Here's how it all unfolded. Claire Johnson had always dreamed of owning her own home. When she finally purchased a quaint little house in a quiet suburb, it felt like a long-awaited triumph. Her yard, though modest in size, became her sanctuary. Every Saturday, she would step outside with her gardening gloves, tending to the flowers she had planted in memory of her late mother. Among her favorites were the roses, delicate and vibrant, a living tribute to a cherished past and a hopeful future. One serene morning, the usual tranquility was broken by faint sounds coming from the front of her yard. Claire initially dismissed it as a neighbor mowing their lawn, but when she stepped outside to fetch the morning paper, she froze in surprise. Neatly planted rows of young trees now lined the edge of her yard, right along the boundary with the street. Their placement was so precise, it was clear they hadn't grown there naturally. "When did this happen?" she murmured, staring at the freshly planted trees. The soil around their roots was still loose, and traces of recent digging were evident. Someone had worked here, but who and why? Later that day, while taking a stroll around the neighborhood, Claire spotted Mrs. Harrison, an older neighbor known for her friendly demeanor. "What do you think of the new greenery?" Mrs. Harrison called out cheerfully. Claire raised an eyebrow. "The trees? Who planted them?" Mrs. Harrison smiled warmly. "Oh, it was the HOA, of course. They must have decided to spruce up the neighborhood. You know how they like to keep things looking perfect." Claire didn't know. Being new to the area, she had yet to encounter much involvement from the local homeowners association. But something about Mrs. Harrison's casual tone unsettled her. Could they really plant trees on her property without even asking? A few days later, an official-looking envelope with the HOA logo appeared in Claire's mailbox. Inside was a letter that began with a friendly tone. "Dear Miss Johnson, as part of our neighborhood beautification program, we are pleased to inform you of the completion of tree planting on your property boundary." But the letter quickly shifted in tone. "The total cost of landscaping is $2,000. Additionally, a monthly maintenance fee of $150 will be charged to ensure the upkeep of the trees. Thank you for your cooperation." Claire read the letter twice, her disbelief quickly turning into anger. "This has to be some kind of joke," she muttered, clutching the paper. Not only had they invaded her property without permission, but they were also billing her for the privilege. Her home, her safe space, was no longer entirely her own. It felt like a violation, plain and simple. But she wasn't one to back down. Claire's initial shock gave way to resolve. She folded the letter neatly, grabbed her jacket, and set out to confront the HOA. This was her property, and she wouldn't let anyone take that away from her, not without a fight. The room where the HOA meeting was held was far from inviting. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold, sterile glow on the rows of chairs neatly lined up in the community center. Claire stepped in, gripping the letter that had kept her awake for the past 2 nights. Her heart pounded, but she steadied herself. She wasn't here to start a fight. She just wanted answers. At the front of the room sat Marcus Black, the HOA president. He was a tall man with a commanding presence, dressed in a crisp suit that seemed out of place for such a casual meeting. His expression was as unyielding as his posture, and his trademark smug smile sent a chill through Claire. As the meeting wrapped up and the residents began to trickle out, Claire approached him, her determination outweighing her nervousness. "I'm Mr. Black," she began, holding up the letter. "I need to talk to you about this landscaping project." Marcus barely glanced up from the stack of papers in front of him. "Ah, Miss Johnson," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I trust you're pleased with the improvements?" "Pleased?" Claire's voice trembled, though not with fear. "You planted trees on my property without my permission, and now you're billing me for it?" Marcus set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "It's part of our beautification initiative," he explained, as if he were addressing a child. "The trees enhance the curb appeal of the neighborhood. Naturally, you're responsible for their maintenance." Claire tightened her grip on the letter. "But it's my land. You can't just come onto my property and do whatever you want." Marcus raised an eyebrow, the corners of his mouth twitching into a dismissive smirk. "Ms. Johnson, HOA regulations allow us to maintain the aesthetic standards of the community. This is for the greater good. If you refuse to pay, we'll have no choice but to issue fines." The audacity of his words left Claire momentarily speechless. She glanced around the room, hoping for some sign of support, but the other board members averted their gazes, avoiding her eyes. Their silence felt complicit, as if they had all agreed she was just another troublemaker disrupting their plans. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the condescension hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Claire took a deep breath, her frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "This isn't right," she said firmly. "You can't impose these decisions on people without consulting them. I won't stand for it." Marcus shrugged, already turning his attention back to the papers on his desk. "You're welcome to file a formal complaint, Miss Johnson. Good luck with that." As Claire left the room, the indignation she felt was compounded by a new sight. A shiny new sign planted squarely on her front yard. It bore the HOA logo and read, "Landscaping Project, sponsored by HOA." It was as though they had staked a claim on her home, turning her private property into a billboard for their agenda. Her hands trembled as she stared at the sign, the weight of the encounter pressing down on her. This wasn't just about the trees or the bill. This was about her autonomy, her rights as a homeowner. And now it was personal. Claire didn't yet know how, but one thing was certain: she wasn't going to let this go. Claire found herself pacing in her kitchen, the HOA letter still on the table, its bold type glaring back at her like a silent dare. She couldn't shake the encounter with Marcus Black, nor the smug looks from the other board members. Every time she glanced out the window, the rows of freshly planted trees mocked her, their very presence a reminder of how easily her rights had been disregarded. But Claire wasn't the type to give up without a fight. She needed help. Surely, others in the neighborhood had faced similar issues. The next day, Claire began knocking on doors, hoping to find support among her neighbors. Most responses were discouraging. One woman, her eyes darting nervously to the street, whispered, "I'd love to help, but I can't risk it. They fined us $500 last year for not painting our mailbox the exact shade of beige they wanted. We can't afford to get on their bad side." Another neighbor barely opened the door, muttering something about not wanting to get involved before closing it abruptly. Claire's frustration grew with each conversation. It felt as though the HOA had cast a shadow of fear over the entire community. People were too scared of fines, penalties, and the ever-present threat of legal action to stand up for themselves. But just as she was about to lose hope, she knocked on the door of Bill Harris, a retired veteran who had lived in the neighborhood for over 3 decades. His house was unassuming, with a well-kept garden and a small American flag fluttering in the breeze. Bill invited her in, his voice warm but tinged with weariness. Over cups of coffee in his cozy living room, Claire poured out her story. Bill listened intently, nodding occasionally, his expression growing grimmer as she spoke. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and let out a heavy sigh. "They've been pulling stunts like this for years," he said, his voice steady but laced with quiet anger, pushing people around, making them feel powerless. "But you don't have to take it lying down." Claire felt a flicker of hope. "What can I do?" she asked. Bill reached for an old, weathered folder from a nearby shelf and began flipping through its contents. "First," he said, "you need to know your rights. HOA rules don't override property laws, no matter what they say. I know a good lawyer in town who specializes in cases like this. She's helped folks in worse situations." With Bill's help, Claire contacted the lawyer, who confirmed what Bill had suspected. The HOA's actions might very well be illegal. However, to build a case, Claire needed solid evidence, property records, HOA bylaws, and proof that the trees were planted without her consent. In the days that followed, Claire dove into the task with renewed determination. She visited the county office to obtain a copy of her property's cadastral map, which clearly showed the boundary line. Meanwhile, Bill helped her organize the documents and even shared stories of his own run-ins with the HOA. His steady support was a lifeline, keeping her grounded as she waded through the mounting stress. But just as Claire began to feel a sense of progress, the HOA ramped up their pressure. She started receiving violation notices for alleged infractions, including unkept landscaping and failure to maintain community standards. It didn't matter that the trees were freshly planted or that she had no say in their placement. The letters became increasingly threatening, warning of escalating fines, and even the possibility of a lien on her property if she didn't comply. Her mailbox seemed to overflow daily with HOA correspondence, each new letter more hostile than the last. The weight of their accusations and demands began to feel suffocating, like a storm cloud looming over her once peaceful home. Claire knew the stakes were rising, but she refused to back down. With Bill's encouragement and the lawyer's guidance, she pressed on, determined to uncover the truth and reclaim her rights. What Claire didn't yet realize was that her fight was about to expose far more than just a few trees. It was about to shine a light on the HOA's deeper, more insidious practices. And she wasn't going to face it alone. Claire sat in her dimly lit kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the silence. Stacks of papers surrounded her, printouts, notes, and legal documents, all meticulously organized. The soft light of a desk lamp illuminated her determined face as she pored over the cadastral map of her property for the 100th time. Her eyes scanned the boundaries, and there it was, clear proof that the trees planted by the HOA were well within her property lines. It wasn't just an overreach, it was a blatant violation of her rights. The discovery fueled her resolve. Armed with the map and her lawyer's advice, Claire filed an official complaint in court. But she didn't stop there. She reached out to local journalists, sharing her story in the hopes of drawing attention to the HOA's practices. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been silenced by fear or intimidation. It didn't take long for her story to make waves. A local newspaper ran an article titled, "Homeowner Stands Up to HOA Over Property Rights Violation." The headline, paired with a picture of Claire standing defiantly next to the unwanted trees, caught the attention of the community and beyond. Readers flooded the comments section, many sharing similar experiences. The story sparked outrage, but what came next turned it into a full-blown scandal. Digging deeper, journalists uncovered a troubling pattern. Marcus Black, the HOA president, had been misusing association funds for years. Records showed that he had funneled money into questionable projects, including the landscaping Claire had been forced to confront. The contractor responsible for the tree planting turned out to be a close friend of Marcus, and their dealings were anything but transparent. The public outcry grew louder with each revelation. By the time the case reached court, the courtroom was packed. Residents, journalists, and even curious onlookers filled the benches, eager to see how it would unfold. Claire sat beside her lawyer, clutching her stack of evidence. Across the room, Marcus sat with his own legal team, his once confident demeanor replaced by visible unease. When it was his turn to speak, Marcus tried to frame his actions as being in the community's best interest. The landscaping project was intended to enhance the neighborhood, he claimed, his voice measured but strained. My actions were motivated by a desire to improve property values and create a unified aesthetic. Claire's lawyer wasted no time dismantling his argument. With precision and clarity, she presented the cadastral map, HOA bylaws, and financial records that painted a damning picture. Testimonies from other residents further solidified the case, each story a piece of the larger puzzle. The evidence was overwhelming. The judge, unimpressed by Marcus's defense, delivered a sharp rebuke. The actions of the HOA, under your leadership, have not only violated property rights, but have also betrayed the trust of the residents you were meant to serve, he declared. The verdict was clear. The trees were to be removed at the HOA's expense, and all associated fines and fees against Claire were nullified. But the fallout didn't end there. The exposure of Marcus's financial misconduct led to further investigations. The friendship with the contractor, the misuse of HOA funds, the unilateral decisions. It all pointed to a pattern of self-serving behavior. Marcus now faced allegations of fraud, and the community he once controlled was demanding his resignation. As the courtroom emptied, Claire felt an overwhelming wave of relief and vindication. For the first time in weeks, she could breathe freely. Residents approached her, some apologizing for their earlier reluctance to stand with her, others thanking her for having the courage to fight back. The small, quiet woman they had underestimated had brought down the man who thought he was untouchable. Outside the courthouse, Claire stood under the warm sun, a newfound sense of empowerment coursing through her. She knew the fight wasn't over. Change rarely came easy, but she had proven that even the smallest voice could echo loudly enough to shake a corrupt system. And now, with the community rallying behind her, she was no longer alone. The morning sunlight streamed through the curtains of Claire's living room, casting a warm glow over the room. She stood by the window, her fingers gently resting on the frame as she watched a crew of workers methodically uproot the rows of trees that had caused her so much anguish. The rhythmic sound of shovels striking soil filled the air, each strike feeling like a small victory. The bright orange vests of the workers stood out against the lush green of the lawn, a visual reminder that justice had finally been served. Claire's heart swelled with a mix of relief and pride. She had spent weeks fighting an uphill battle against an organization that had seemed untouchable. Yet here she was, watching the evidence of their overreach being removed piece by piece. The trees, which once symbolized intrusion and manipulation, were now being cleared away, making room for her own vision of what her yard should be. It wasn't just about the land. It was about reclaiming her autonomy and honoring the memories tied to this space. Her lawyer had called the previous evening to confirm the court's ruling. The HOA was not only ordered to remove the trees, but also to cover her legal fees and pay compensation for the stress and disruption they had caused. Marcus Black, the once untouchable president, had been forced to step down. The scandal surrounding his misuse of HOA funds had left him disgraced, and the board was now under intense scrutiny. Claire felt a sense of poetic justice in how everything had unfolded. She turned her gaze to her small flower bed, where the roses she had planted in memory of her mother stood in full bloom. Their vibrant petals seemed to catch the sunlight, almost as if they were celebrating alongside her. Later that afternoon, as the last of the trees were hauled away, neighbors began to gather on the sidewalk, their curiosity evident. Some approached cautiously, offering words of encouragement and even apologies for not speaking up sooner. "We were afraid," one woman admitted, her voice tinged with regret. "But what you've done? It's inspiring." Bill Harris, her steadfast ally throughout the ordeal, was among the first to congratulate her. "You showed them," he said with a proud grin. "You didn't just fight for yourself, you fought for all of us." Claire smiled, feeling the weight of his words sink in. She hadn't realized it at first, but her battle had become something bigger than herself. It had sparked conversations among the residents about the unchecked power of the HOA and the importance of standing up for their rights. People were sharing stories of their own struggles with the board, and for the first time, it felt like change was truly possible. As the evening settled in, Claire sat on her porch, sipping a cup of tea and reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The fight had been exhausting, filled with moments of doubt and frustration, but it had also been empowering. She had learned that even in the face of overwhelming opposition, persistence and courage could make a difference. Looking out over her now open yard, she felt a deep sense of peace. This was more than just a plot of land. It was her home, her sanctuary, and a testament to her resilience. And now, it was fully hers again. For the first time in weeks, Claire allowed herself to truly relax. She leaned back in her chair, letting the cool evening breeze wash over her. She knew there would be more challenges ahead. Life always found a way of testing you, but she also knew she was ready for them. Because if this fight had taught her anything, it was that even the smallest voices could carry the power to change everything.